everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm a new member of the board of directors for Cedar Mountain Battlefield, and we can't do anything without your love, support, and dedication. So thank you for helping us do our mission to preserve the Cedar Mountain Battlefield. Today we are having an awesome lecture from Frank O'Reilly, who is a longtime historian and park ranger with the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. He's the author of several books, including his award-winning book on the Fredericksburg Campaign, subtitled Winter War on the Rappahannock, as well as many articles in various civil-related publications. He has prepared countless lectures on various aspects of the American Civil War and has been featured repeatedly on C-SPAN. Presently, he is working on a book, Retreat from Victory, the Battle of Malvern Hill, and the end of 7 days, July 1, 1862, which I can assure that we all await with great anticipation. Tonight, he'll be discussing how the Battle of Cedar Mountain influenced Confederate artillery tactics and practices during the latter half of the American Civil War. Everyone, please give a welcome to Frank O'Reilly.
Thank you very much. It's great to see so many faces that I recognize and have you come back. I'm excited to talk to you tonight about one of my favorite aspects of the entire Cedar Mountain battlefield, and that is the part of the Army that appeals to me the most, and that's artillery. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at Confederate artillery. And the best place to start talking about Cedar Mountain is to talk about the battle that precedes Cedar Mountain. You'll have to excuse the screen for being so dark. So just imagine what Malvern Hill looked like at evening time. July 1st, 1862, Malvern Hill. Confederate artillery attempted to soften up the Federal positions prior to Robert E. Lee giving an all-out assault to destroy the Union Army at the end of the 7 days battles. It was a disaster. As soon as we unlimbered our guns, complained one of Jackson's artillerists, all the Yankee batteries on the hill beyond stopped firing on the woods and poured into us the most deadly fire I ever witnessed during the war. The whirlwind was absolutely breathtaking. Carter Barkley of the Hanover Artillery wrote, "In a few minutes, men and horses were killed and wounded, guns were dismantled, and caissons almost annihilated. Men ran away, they abandoned their equipment, and they left their cannons." Major General Daniel Harvey Hill called the Confederate artillery performance at Malvern Hill farcical. Southern batteries were utterly wrecked and humiliated at Malvern Hill. Southerners had no chance. They were smothered by massed firepower from heavier guns and even naval ordnance by the Union Army. The Confederates failed to even try to mass their guns. They entered the fray piecemeal and with a wide assortment of lighter, very limited range guns like 6-pounder bronze smoothbore weapons, and were utterly useless against rifle pieces like the 3-inch ordnance rifle or the 10-pound Parrots, much less the heavier guns that the Federals had in reserve, like 30-pound Parrots and 4.5-inch siege guns, 24-pounder howitzers, and the U.S. Navy's heavy Dahlgren deck guns. In the aftermath, Confederate artillerists were deeply upset and disillusioned with their own performance. The artillery historian for the Confederacy, Jennings Cropper Wise, said that after this moment, the great crisis of the artillery's youth had been Malvern Hill. A crisis indeed. Batteries like the Rockbridge Artillery counted only 70 men present left in their ranks out of a roll that should have been 150. They had only enough men to crew 3 of their 6 guns. The Purcell Artillery had only 85 men and only 2 functional guns left. The batteries in Major General Richard S. Ewell's division averaged only 3 officers and 56 men per battery. Eventually, new commanders took control of a significant number of the batteries in Lee's army. In Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson's command, he had 14 batteries in his command. But of the 14, he also had 6 new commanders of batteries coming out of the 7 days. New batteries also wound up joining Lee's army in the month that followed that battle. Jackson received 5 new batteries in this period of time. William Demet's 1st Maryland Artillery, William Brown's Chesapeake Artillery, Louis Daquin's Louisiana Guard Artillery, William Hardy's Middlesex Artillery, and Nathaniel Terry's Bedford Artillery all joined Jackson's command in the immediate aftermath of the July battle around Richmond. Brigadier General Charles S. Winder's division, Jackson's old division, retained 3 of its original 6 batteries, sending off the other 3 to different commands. Ewell's division dropped 4 of its 5 batteries and picked up 3 new ones while doing it. Some battery commanders were able to update their batteries with heavier guns to replace some of the obsolete 6-pounder pieces. Some were guns that they had captured from Major General George Britton McClellan's Army of the Potomac during the Peninsula Campaign. The Confederates were able to net 17 guns out of that. They also were able to recast some of their own guns in the ironworks like Tredegar in Richmond. All told, Jackson had 47 cannon in his command. That was an average of 1 gun for every 500 soldiers. The Confederates also began to experiment with the idea of artillery battalions, of having batteries not function exclusively with brigades, but to bring the batteries together and work as one to mass their firepower. It wasn't set in stone and there was no principle written, but the practice was already being discussed. In terms of ordnance, Jennings Cropper's Wise thought the Confederates had actually begun to rival the Federals at this point in the war. But he admitted that the Southerners were still, quote, far behind in terms of discipline, mounts, and equipment. Some of the transition in the aftermath of the 7 days was a little rough for the Confederate artillery commanders. Captain William T. Pogue of the Rockbridge Artillery confessed, there were minor matters of administration and discipline that could no longer be overlooked, but which had not been enforced by my predecessor. So I soon found myself getting unpopular, and I was disliked by a certain class of men. And this, of course, was not pleasant for me, and my position was a trying one. Who was he unpopular with? The people that like to cut corners and not do the job. 5 weeks later, August 9th, 1862, and we're here at Cedar Mountain. Stonewall Jackson and his chief of artillery, Colonel Stapleton Crutchfield, established what they called sets of guns along different parts of the Confederate battle line. Major Richard Snowden Andrews set up elements of several batteries near the gate off of the Culpeper Road. Batteries typically carried an array of different types of guns to respond to different types of circumstances. All guns did not fit all circumstances, as you can well imagine. And in this case, Jackson and Crutchfield coached their artillery commanders to bring up their best long-range guns to cope with Major General Nathaniel P. Banks' Federal artillery, some of which was concentrating less than 500 yards away from them. Captain Joseph H. Carpenter, commander of the Allegheny Roughs, or simply the Allegheny Artillery, brought forward one 10-pounder Parrott. His other guns were small caliber smoothbore weapons and not sufficient to the needs of that moment. The person in charge of the lone Parrott was Lieutenant John R. Carpenter, the battery commander's brother. Captain William T. Pogue of the Rockbridge Artillery brought up 2 10-pound Parrots and 1 smoothbore 12-pound Napoleon. Pogue had 1 more gun with him. The 4th was a 6-pounder light bronze piece, which he opted to leave in the rear. Captain William Caskey brought up another 10-pound Parrot, and that was from his battery known as the Hampton Artillery. Together, Snowden Andrews had 5 cannon wedged in the corner of the field by the gate, with Carpenter's gun literally resting on the Culpeper Road. Farther to the right was Major Alfred R. Courtney, where he arranged guns by the Cedars and also behind the Crittenden House. Captain William D. Brown's Chesapeake Artillery from Maryland planted 1 3-inch ordnance rifle by the Cedars. Next to him came William F. Devitt's 1st Maryland Battery, and they set up 2 smoothbore 12-pound Napoleons. Brown's rifle had considerably more distance and accuracy over Devitt's smoothbores, but Devitt's guns could be more versatile when dealing with Union artillery or infantry if they got too close. So Brown was expected to engage exclusively against enemy artillery, but Devitt might have been there to contribute to either going against the artillery or to protect Brown in case the Federal skirmishers got too close and became a nuisance. Over by the Crittenden House, Alfred Courtney arrayed another 5 guns from Captain Louis Daquin's Louisiana Guard Artillery and the other half of Devitt's Maryland Battery. Daquin had 4 rifles. He had 3-inch ordnance rifles and 10-pound Parrots. Now, the Louisiana Guard Artillery was brand new and had never been in battle before. They were an unknown quantity going onto this battlefield. But they were certainly nothing like their more highbrow brethren of the Washington Artillery of New Orleans, which at this particular point in the war required papers of pedigree just to join their ranks. Daquin was not nearly as choosy. The neophytes unfortunately made a bad debut. They lost one of their guns before they even could get into the battle. Just coming onto the field, they busted the axle on one of their guns, crossing, quote, rough fields. And they found themselves down to 3. The Devitt's battery had another pair of smoothbore 12-pounder Napoleons to add to this little mix. For one moment, Courtney had another rifle with him, a Parrot that belonged to Captain Joseph R. Latimer, but that was quickly reallocated to the very far right of Jackson's line, because the division commander, Major General Richard S. Ewell, personally led Captain Joseph W. Latimer's Courtney Henrico Artillery up to a shelf on Cedar Mountain by the Reverend Philip Slaughter's house. Latimer inherited Alfred Courtney's battery when Courtney became the division chief of artillery. But most people recognize that Joe Latimer was actually the disciplinary genius behind Courtney, and we're happy to have him as the battery commander. As you can see, he looks quite young if you can catch him. Latimer marshaled 4 guns up on the shelf by the house. 2 of them were 3-inch ordnance rifles, and the other 2 were not defined, but they were likely to be 12-pound Napoleons. And setting up next to him was a Lieutenant, Nathaniel Terry, who added 2 guns, 2 12-pounder howitzers from his Bedford Artillery Command. So Jackson, at this point, just setting up at Cedar Mountain, had 19 guns arrayed in 3 concentrated areas spread across a mile front. Later, Jackson would add 2 more batteries under Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Lindsay Walker. And that would be the battery of Captain William R.J. Pegram, or Willie Pegram, who added 1 10-pounder Parrot and 1 12-pound Napoleon from the Purcell Artillery of Virginia, and Lieutenant William B. Hardy added another pair of guns, bringing Jackson's total up to 23 cannon. Jackson used fully half of all the cannons he had in his command at Cedar Mountain. The artillery commanders were a young lot. The oldest was Captain William F. Demmett, who came in at a startling old age of 36. He was the old man of the artillery. The youngest was Captain Joseph Latimer, who was half Demmett's age. He was 18 years old. Cherubic Willie Pegram was just 1 year older than him. He was 19. The average age of the artillery commanders was young. They were 25 and a half years in age in average. The men that they commanded were even younger. The average age of the artillerist was 24 and a half years old. So a commander on average was 1 year older than their men. Several of these commanders of artillery were students in school when the war broke out in 1861. Willie J. Pegram was studying law at the University of Virginia in 1861. Joe Latimer and Thomas Hardy both were attending the Virginia Military Institute as cadets when the war broke out. Now, more than 1/3 of all the artillery commanders had some professional military education. Latimer and Hardy obviously were VMI cadets in 1861, but Stapleton Crutchfield and Carpenter Walker had all been graduates of the Virginia Military Institute. In fact, after he graduated, Crutchfield stayed and became the mathematics instructor at VMI. And all of these commanders, with the exception of Lindsey Walker, had learned their artillery tactics under Professor Thomas J. Jackson. Pogue and others didn't have that experience, even though they lived in the town where the Virginia Military Institute hailed from. Many of them came from professional backgrounds that you would never associate with artillery, much less a military venture. Pogue was practicing law in 1861 in St. Joe's, Missouri. Alfred Courtney was also a lawyer in Maryland. William Caskey was a Richmond merchant. Louis Daquin was a businessman in New Orleans. Nathaniel Terry was a tobacconist when the war broke out. Snowden Andrews was an architect from Baltimore who had gained some kind of notoriety because he had designed the governor's mansion in Annapolis and also the south wing of the U.S. Treasury building in Washington. The Battle of Cedar Mountain. Confederates engaged the first phase of this battle as a long-range, long-distance artillery barrage to buy time for Jackson's army to come up and deploy and then assume offensive operations. One of the artillerists under Jackson proclaimed this the prettiest artillery duel ever witnessed. To another, a member of Brown's Maryland battery thought quite opposite and said it was one of the most terrible artillery duels of the war. Many Southerners had negotiated their way onto the battlefield by way of the gate on the Culpeper Road. And unfortunately, Snowden Andrews had set up his guns so they not only crowded the choke point, but their fire also attracted counter fire, which blanketed that spot. The heavy concentration of Confederate infantry and artillery all at that one spot by the gate made that spot rich with targets for the Federals. And shortly after the action started, William Pogue and Rockbridge Artillery ran into trouble. The vent on one of his parrots had become too enlarged to fire safely because they couldn't control the spark, they couldn't control the gun. And as that was the result, the captain had to send that parrot to the rear. The only replacement he had on hand was the one gun he rejected at the outset, a measly 6-pounder brass smoothbore. To replace a rifle piece? Would you take that 6-pounder, or would you just leave that to the rear? In this case, Pope brought it up. It wasn't going to contribute very much to any kind of duel, but it could probably be an insurance precaution, maybe, against Federal infantry if they got within 200 yards of the Confederate artillery. But on another level, Pope continued to overcrowd that spot and put in a gun that really was ineffectual. They probably would have done better without it. In the same barrage, Carpenter's gun crew on that one lone Parrott began to flag in the intense heat of the battle. Lieutenant John Carpenter said his men felt unable to do anything in a very short time. Captain Carpenter started to bring forward replacement men, but he didn't get there. He was mortally struck down, hit on the head by a piece of shrapnel. Lieutenant John Carpenter assumed command of his brother's battery. Initially, Captain Joe Carpenter was reported as only being, quote, slightly wounded, but he never recovered. And 6 months later, he was dead. While Jackson continued to think more about building an infantry line to the right of the gate, more towards the mountain, leaders have a tendency to personally drift to where they perceive danger. And during the battle or the artillery fight, Jackson spent a considerable portion of his time by the guns near the gates and by the cedars. The commander of Jackson's old division, sickly Brigadier General Charles S. Winder, also migrated to the guns by the gates. Winder was professionally trained artillerist himself from Maryland. He had a special love-loathe kind of relationship with Stonewall Jackson and had repeatedly contemplated resigning his commission just to escape Jackson's imperious, demanding measures. Charles Winder fell mortally wounded while observing Pogue's and Carpenter's fire. A Federal shell had plunged through his side, goring him. Concerned officers and men, including Snowden Andrews, offered feeble words of encouragement to the dying general as he lay there. Winder died shortly afterwards in a nearby schoolhouse. He was the only general that was killed in the Battle of Cedar Mountain. And moments later, Major Snowden Andrews suffered almost the exact same wound. A piece of shell struck the lower part of his right side, tearing apart the wall of his abdomen, was the report. The jacket that you see in the upper corner is the jacket he was wearing when struck, and you can see the damage on the front of it. The officer was nearly disemboweled. His liver was protruding from the gaping wound in his side. Andrews had the presence of mind at that moment to slide off his horse and to fall on his back, preventing his insides from spilling out. Still, soldiers and doctors gave him little hope of survival from such an eviscerating wound. He was given up for dead right on the spot and was left there for several hours unattended. One doctor examined what he called a great chasm in his side and proclaimed, "To Andrews, there is no hope for you," and walked along. Andrews proceeded to shout after that physician, saying, once in his youth, he was fox hunting and he had a valuable dog almost disemboweled when it was trying to jump over a fence and didn't make it. Andrews nursed that dog back to health personally, and that dog lived to hunt again The doctor was unmoved. Andrews challenged yet another skeptical doctor, a fellow named Fred Hunter, to at least try to save him. He asked, "Hunter, is there no chance at all?" And the doctor replied, "Yes, Major, maybe 1 in 100. And determined, Andrews responded, "Well, then I will take the 1. He was left at the roadside home of James Garnett. He was taken prisoner by the Federals after the battle and paroled because nobody could move him. And incredibly, Snowden Andrews survived. One admirer noted with amazement, his recovery was a triumph of mind over matter. Believe it or not, he would return to active service within a year. Stonewall Jackson assessed the situation that was going on around Pogues and Caskies and Carpenters, and he decided to adjust things. He shifted their guns and moved them a little to the right, away from the gate. And this allowed the guns to escape a very highly visible position. It also cleared the choke point by the gate, and it offered a better angle of fire against the Federals. It's almost ironic when we consider how many high-profile injuries occurred around these guns that the Rockbridge artillery itself reported only 2 casualties. Carpenter's and Caskey's batteries each reported only 2 losses each. The artillerists were the safe ones. It was the officers braided around them that were in jeopardy. On top of that, Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Lindsay Walker was able to add those last 4 guns to the fight, bringing up sections of Pegram's and Hardy's batteries at this time that we see Pogue and the others shift. Walker attempted to bring up more guns from Major General A.P. Hill's division, but the traffic snarled back down the Culpeper Road leading to the battlefield was so bad that it was literally a Herculean effort just to get 4 guns to the front. Confederate artillerists in this battle gave as good as they got. The Federals suffered under a converging fire all across their front. I don't know how well you can see this image of Joseph Knapp's Pennsylvania battery, but it's very compelling because if you look at it, the Union guns are facing in 2 different directions because the Confederates have converging fire on them. Stapleton Crutchfield reported the Confederate cannon were excellently served and completely occupied the enemy's guns. Crutchfield noted that Brown's and Demet's batteries were capitally served and evidently damaged the enemy severely. Pogue particularly recognized Joe Latimer's efforts out on the shelf of the mountain. He said that Latimer greatly annoyed them, especially their artillery. The Confederates certainly annoyed the Federals, but they never completely suppressed the Federals. After 2.5 hours of an artillery duel, neither one had gained the upper hand artillery-wise, but the Confederates, by holding their own, had provoked a direct Federal response to them, and that was a Union assault against the Confederate left and center. The Federals made a breakthrough and neutralized some of the Confederate guns on the left for a moment, and put Pogue and the Rockbridge artillery in great jeopardy. Pogue stated, "In the confusion that ensued from the rear attack, my guns were rendered useless, being surrounded by our infantry." Federals closed to within 150 to 200 yards of those batteries. And Pogue complained more about getting hit by mini balls than by artillery shells. Pogue's artillerymen were literally surrounded by pandemonium at this point. The Confederates, according to one of the artillerists, were on the verge of panic. William Pogue claimed, "We were on the edge of serious disaster. Had we remained here, we would have been destroyed or captured. But Jackson helped rally the troops, as the Don Trioni painting shows us. Stonewall is with you. But so did Brigadier General William B. Tolliver wade into this mix to help rally the men. But Pope noted that even more effective than Jackson or Tolliver, he gave credit to a private, David Rittenhouse Barton, who came from his battery and helped rally the men. The captain recalled, "In the melee, the most conspicuous person, as I remember it, was not only General Jackson and General W.B. Tolliver, but it was David Barton, a private in our battery, who managed to make the men stand." Barton was a 27-year-old school teacher who lived in Baltimore when the war broke out. He was promoted 10 days after Cedar Mountain for his gallantry, and he was dead within 4 months at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Across the front, Federals menaced Pegram's and Hardee's cannons as well. Pegram found the Federals getting so close to his guns coming out of the corn that he had to switch from firing shells to firing canister, and then firing double loads of canister to stay the attackers. The Federals closed to within 100 yards and had successfully shot down one of the limber horses before Pegram was able to evacuate his gun. Lieutenant Ham Chamberlain, who served with Pegram, confessed, "For a few minutes, the mini balls were awful. I was more nervous than I had been before, but I trust I did my duty." 4 rounds perforated the skirts of Captain Pegram's uniform jacket while he was orchestrating the defense. The captain desperately grabbed for his own battery's flag and pleaded with the men, "Don't let the enemy have these guns or this flag." He ordered the gun crews, "Go on, men, give it to them." They fired one last round of canister at almost point-blank range, and it stayed the Federals. This allowed Pegram to withdraw his gun a couple hundred yards to safer quarters and try again. Pegram had to leave 3 dead horses and a caisson behind. He later retrieved the caisson after dark. Once Jackson blunted the Federal offensive, the Confederate commander ordered a general advance across his front. Nathaniel Banks prudently withdrew in darkness, and Jackson's men pursued him into that dark. As Jackson drew up short of us right here at Cedar Run Church, he ordered several of Reuben Lindsay Walker's batteries to shell the woods beyond us. And that was one of the most unique parts of this battle, because after dark, the lead elements of the Confederate pursuit, the reconnaissance element, was not cavalry or infantry, it was artillery. Stapleton Crutchfield ordered the guns to fire 8 rounds per gun, quote, "in various directions." Now, why would they fight in various directions? Because it's so dark out here on the battlefield when they reached this church that they had no idea where the Federals were concentrated and where they might be lurking in the woods, or if they were even located here on the battlefield at all anymore. And when they tried it, the Confederates elicited a very small response. The Federals did not fire back. Jackson then advanced Pegram's battery and 2 brigades of infantry to occupy the woods beside us and out beyond. Pegram set up on a small knoll on the far side of the woods around 10 p.m. At that point, he became aware of the sound of Federals going into camp nearby. Pegram personally rode ahead to reconnoiter and learn more about that chatter. He advised one of his lieutenants that he would wave his arms to signal the guns to open fire once he saw where the Federals were. Pegram went so far to the front, he nearly blundered into the Union 7th Indiana Regiment. Before he recognized his mistake, he quickly stopped, turned around, and wildly gestured for his battery to open fire. But at 10 o'clock in the dark, nobody saw him. So at that point, he flew back to his battery as fast as his horse could take him. And just as he reached the battery, his men jumped into action. Pegram shouted, "Pitch in, men! General Jackson is looking at you." The battery startled the Federals for a moment, but converging fire immediately changed the tables. The Northerners brought 4 batteries to play on Pegram, all of them converging and illuminating the knoll just beyond us. Captain Pegram called it the hottest time for me of the entire battle was that night. Pegram's men didn't stand a chance. Ham Chamberlain noted Willie Pegram acted with his usual gallantry and also suffered in men and horses. A battery member stated, "This was one of the hottest actions the battery was ever in for that short time that we were ever engaged." Federals blew up at least 1 limber or caisson here. They disabled 2 of Pegram's guns here, and Pegram still clung to his position until the fire petered out. But his losses were significant. In the overall battle, the Confederates reported about 24 casualties among their artillery units. Pegram's battery alone counted for 13 of those 24, almost all of them in this final fracas of the evening. It's also interesting to note that Pegram lost 11 men at that farcical battle at Malvern Hill. He lost 13 at Cedar Mountain. He lost more here. In terms of losses, Cedar Mountain was the costliest battle Pegram's battery ever fought, with the exception of 1 battle, and that was Beaver Dam Creek or Mechanicsville, where they lost a startling 46 members. Overall, the Confederate artillery suffered actually pretty close to 30 casualties. Though Dr. Lafayette Guild, of the medical director for Lee's Army, reported only 20 casualties among the artillerists. That's a big discrepancy. William Pogue hints at part of why this discrepancy might happen, and it's just the way they report what they would consider to be a wound. Pogue reported that he had 2 hurt, but conceded that several others received very slight bruises from pieces of shell, striking them at various parts of their body and leaving them badly cut or bruised, but they never reported for any kind of medical help. Assessing the effectiveness of Jackson's artillery at Cedar Mountain, how do you feel about their performance? Did they do well? Given that just 1 month before, they were absolutely putrid. This is an amazing turnaround. The Confederate cannon crews lost between 20 and 30 men. The Federal artillery they fought against lost 42 men. William T. Pogue said, "In this battle, our artillery contributed its full share to the final victory." And he had every right to say that. Lieutenant Ham Chamberlain noted that the Federals could drive away the Confederates when they had heavily massed guns at Malvern Hill and a navy to back them up on the James River. But he crowed after this battle, saying, "No gunboats here." And that changed everything. Confederates acquitted themselves quite well in this battle. Jackson's gunners benefited from a combination of not only terrain and happenstance, but they occupied several critical locations with a front that took on the ability for them to concentrate their fire. They had good terrain in the sense that Cedar Mountain was moderately high. So was the ground around the gate. The Confederates utilized their guns in combinations of batteries instead of just working with individual batteries by themselves. And this enhanced their firepower. And it was something akin to a pseudo-battalion system, except it wasn't quite a system yet. They were not only massing their firepower, but they had created a rubric by which converging fire would help suppress the opposition. And that dominated portions of the Federal line along the Mitchell Station Road. Going forward, the Confederates would seek opportunities to exploit the terrain like they had here, to mass their guns like they had here, and to find converging fire whenever possible. 2nd Manassas, August 30th, 1862. Colonel Stephen D. Lee's Grand Battery harassed and broke several of Major General John Pope's assaults on the Deep Cut and set the stage for the Confederate victory at 2nd Manassas. Antietam, September 17th, 1862. Confederate artillery experienced what was known as artillery hell at the Dunkard Church. But they also created a converging fire on the north end of that battlefield that held the Federals at bay for the entire day. A masked battery on the edge of Sharpsburg itself at the end of the day helped stave off disaster and allows Lee's army to escape when everything else seemed doomed. Fredericksburg, December 13th, 1862. Confederates began to transition to a formal battalion system of artillery. Batteries banded together, making Lee's position at Fredericksburg absolutely impregnable. Chancellorsville, May 3rd, 1863. A day that Artillery Colonel A. Porter Alexander said was the best day of Confederate artillery history. Confederates were able to use their battalions of cannons to not only create a converging fire from a place called Hazel Grove, but also to create the leverage to unhinge an entire Union line and ultimately create Lee's greatest victory. It wasn't infantry that won that battle, it was artillery. Gettysburg, July 3rd, 1863, where Southern artillerists massed an unprecedented number of cannon to converge their fire and soften up Federal positions prior to unleashing Pickett's charge. The firepower was exceptional, even if the results were not. Eventually, the armies found themselves later in the war besieged at Petersburg in 1864 and 1865, where resistance essentially became a story of artillery rather than infantry. In the course of the war, half of the artillery commanders at Cedar Mountain were gone. 5 of them would die in action. Joseph Carpenter was killed as a result of his guns being here at Cedar Mountain. Louis Daquin was killed at Fredericksburg. Joseph Latimer and William D. Brown both died at Gettysburg. Willie Pegram was struck down at Five Forks in the last week of the war. Stapleton Crutchfield lost a leg at Chancellorsville and then died at Sailor's Creek just 72 hours before Appomattox. One of the artillerists that served Jackson here was cashiered, and that was Major Alfred R. Courtney. He was dropped shortly after Antietam for neglect and failing to engage his cannons there. And one of them was Court Marshal, Lieutenant William Hardy, who not only left the artillery, but wound up being relegated to becoming a government inspector down in Southeast Virginia, where he was accidentally captured by a federal party that were just as surprised as him, and he ended the war as a prisoner of war. Nobody felt that they should trade for him. Of the survivors that came out of the fight here in Cedar Mountain, only one of them became a general, and that was Reuben Lindsay Walker. Now, following the war, the surviving commanders chased various civilian pursuits. R. Snowden Andrews, the fellow who should have died here, wound up in Germany trying to procure arms for the Confederacy when the war ended. He moved to Mexico and there supported the Maximilian government until its downfall. And then he retired quietly to his farm in Maryland. Charles Demmett took a job at the U.S. Treasury Department to pay bills. Pogue and Cashier Courtney both returned to the law. General Reuben Lindsay Walker worked as an engineer developing various railroads across the middle states of America. And then there's William Caskey. We haven't spoken much of the commander of the Hampton Artillery, but in many ways, he's the biggest character of them all. After the war, he moved to Galveston, Texas, where everything is big and large. Just ask any Texan. And this man, William Caskey, was bigger and larger than Texans. He became a renowned actor. He became an outstanding artist, a painter, and a published cartoonist who had his works syndicated in many newspapers after the war. Confederate artillery reached an absolute nadir in its effectiveness at Malvern Hill. It couldn't have been more dismal. Southern generals called it a farce, and that was probably going easy on them. But in just 5 weeks, the Confederates had refitted their batteries with newer, heavier, more reliable guns, and significantly changed its leadership, and changed its philosophy, and changed its use. Cedar Mountain showed that the Confederate artillery could be more than just a support for infantry. It could be an effective combat wing of the Army itself, and to arguably become the principal military arm of the Army by the end of this war. This is where it all changes. Cedar Mountain is that test. What would have happened to Confederate artillery if this battle had gone any other way? This is the place where they took a chance and they created a dynamic that they found would work and make them competitive. Thank you. I really appreciate your kindness and your patience with me. But if anybody has any questions or thoughts or anything you'd like to share, please, I'd be more than happy to talk and hear. Yes.
I've got a question. I've got 2 questions, Frank. One is, you always hear about how terrible technology was in Confederates' ordnance,
Right.
uses, etc. Have you heard anything about that? Was there any comments here with something was glaring that happened?
Well, when we look at there's a lot of different ways we can look at this, and decidedly I picked one different lens. When we look at Confederate artillery, putting it face to face with Federal artillery, the Federals have better guns. They have better ammunition. It's more reliable. But we're going to see Union artillery and Confederate artillery adjust their perceptions on what is acceptable to them. If the Federals fire 6 rounds and one of them's a dud, they're going to consider that to be a problem. The Confederates will fire 4 guns, and 2 of them are duds. That's acceptable. That doesn't have anything to do with the gun. It has everything to do with the projectile that they fired and the quality of their powder. And the Confederates do suffer from that. There's no denying that. They also lack the proper equipment that goes with the weapons. They lack the horse flesh that's going to be able to move these weapons.
The pendulum pause, that type of thing.
Right, but once you get the guns in position and have them engaged, Confederate artillery holds its own. And if they can get a way to find leverage over the Federals, it's the fact that the battalion system is going to help them. The Federals have a similar tendency to just use their guns. They have complete dominance from the beginning. So they feel very little compunction at changing much of that. But the Confederates are going to realize that if you go head to head, you're going to be in trouble. But if you pick better positions, that's going to be a military multiplier. That's going to give you an advantage. But to pick higher ground with converging fire means that I also have to separate. And now we have to work in groups. Battalions now become those work groups. And that's really going to be the part where the Confederates feel that they can now spread their guns into these work groups.
Do you mind a follow-up question?
Sure.
My one is, I heard you've spoken about, Malvern Hill in particular, how the Federals, instead of, they'd bring up a whole caisson instead of just a limber. Were they doing that here? Were they dropping off limbers, or were they bringing ammunition chest up, or did we know?
From the few accounts that we have of it, the guns are coming up by limbers. The caissons are not very far away in immediate vicinity, though I haven't found much to suggest that they had to call upon them. They used what was in the limber chest, and as far as I know, though I yield to my friends who know the battlefield better than I do. If you've seen that.
I haven't seen anything.
Okay. There's your authority right there.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what
I say, the caissons and the limbers were put the president, but you don't see a whole lot of documentation about them bringing up the caissons.
Right, were they being erected, is it a schoolhouse where the crossroads are, about, you know what I'm talking about? I don't know.
Where the Culpeper Orange Courthouse
Yes,
Road
yes.
and the Madison Road
Right,
split.
right.
There, that's probably where that's where the schoolhouse was.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike.
Right.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? Oh, Mike.
Yeah. You know, you were talking at the end there about how between Malvern Hill and Cedar Mountain, things are turning for the Confederate artillerists. Do you think, it wasn't a doctrinal change. Do you think the Confederates had their success on August 9th due to the topography, sorry, and the need of certain specific guns as opposed to bringing up full batteries? So it was an initiative thing as opposed to a doctrinal thing.
Right. I think that the Confederates went into this with their eyes wide open. When we see Crutchfield and Jackson assess this battlefield, the guns they asked for are the long-range guns. That's a recognition that all batteries aren't going to bring all pieces, but select batteries are going to bring select pieces. Just that idea alone is letting us know that we've changed doctrine from what we were doing at Malvern Hill. Malvern Hill, they had this notion that they were just going to mass 50 guns in one spot and 60 guns in another, and they didn't even bother to figure out what kind of guns do we have. We're just going to have guns. Spoken like true infantry officers. And now you're starting to get artillerists engaging in that conversation and saying all tools don't work for all things. And that's where you do see that adjustment. I think just that one simple statement asking for the long-range guns tells us we've matured. But you're right, we're not only maturing with what we want as the proper tool, but how to wield the proper tool. Let's look at the ground to its best advantage. Sometimes I think they almost put it under a microscope too much. The ground by the gate is terrific. That would be a wonderful artillery position, but it's a choke point. And maybe that's exactly the one spot you want to keep open. They're gonna learn. This is just 5 weeks. I'm astounded at what a revolution has happened in 5 weeks. There should be bigger and more mistakes on this battlefield than there are. It's not perfect. Again, they clogged the gate. At the end of the day, they sent Willie Pegram out to be the reconnaissance, the head of the Army pursuit. That tells us that even with all of the progress, we're not quite there yet. Though it is pretty cool that the guns open the fight and they end the fight too. Willie Pegram probably would have liked that. Yes?
Yeah, throughout the war, the Confederates generally mixed weapon types did their batteries, whereas the Federal batteries had one weapon type. You think that really affected the Confederates' operational efficiency?
I think that when we look at the rubric between Union batteries and Confederate batteries, yes, Union batteries have tendency to be largely homogeneous, just one type of gun. In mid-1862, that wasn't really necessarily true. A lot of the batteries in McClellan's army actually featured 2 types of guns. And typically, they were 2 different types of rifles. But logistically, the Confederates were feeding up to 3 or 4 different types of guns in each battery. And logistically, that's a nightmare. Being able to come up with one type of ammunition for one type of gun in the midst of an army it's a hard job. Logistics, quite honestly, that's for the real pros. Anybody can do strategy and tactics, but having the right ammunition with the right people at the right time, that's a pro. Now, if that's so hard to do with just one type of ammunition with one type of gun, what do you have to do when you have to come up with 4 types of ammunition for 4 types of guns? You might be bringing forward stuff that doesn't fit your tube. That's also going to create another problem. When we see Federal artillery batteries run out of ammunition, often they're not replaced by other batteries, but they're going to replace the limbers or the caissons, and sometimes take them from other batteries with similar pieces. But the Confederates, when they empty their limber chest and they have nothing left to fight, nobody's going to be able to replenish that. You're just going to have to pull that battery and send somebody else to plug in there. That means downtime. There's going to be a period where you have to remove the battery before somebody else can assume the spot. That makes it inefficient. It also makes it really hard for those coming in to set up under fire to begin with. So, yeah, it's not ideal. It's not perfect. It's not Federal, but it is an interesting revolution and dynamic with working with what you got. Yes?
So if the Confederate artillery improved performance from Malvern Hill to here at Cedar Mountain, what went wrong on the 3rd day of Gettysburg?
What went wrong with the Confederate artillery at the 3rd day of Gettysburg if everything else worked out so great? The 3rd day at Gettysburg is Malvern Hill Redux. We're going to have a beginning of July major assault against wide open fields, and it all is predicated on we're going to soften it up with artillery to begin with. Confederates were able to mask the fire that they did not mask at Malvern Hill. They were able to create the arc of fire that they couldn't get at Malvern Hill. They were able to create the rubric that was missing a year before. But obviously the results don't fill out. And that's where we can go back to, again, 2 things. The Federal line and the quality of the ammunition that is being distributed among the Confederates. Stephen Sears did a really nice job at pointing out that the black powder came from a different source going into Gettysburg, and that it had a higher black powder content to it. So it was actually soaring a little further than expected. from what the artillerists had been used to and plying. So a lot of their shells were going long, bursting around Meade's headquarters rather than on Meade's front line. The other thing is that most of the federal line is on a crest of a very low ridge. It's very difficult to be able to nail that position precisely. Howitzers might be able to lob stuff into it, but not over 9/10 of a mile. So you're going to be hitting it with guns with a lower trajectory, which is either going to hit it perfectly or skim it or just bounce right over it, miss it. Most of it's going to miss. So the Federals benefit from a better position, and they benefit from the fact that the Confederates have an unreliable black powder source.
If I could add as a follow-up, there had been a disaster in Richmond at a munitions plant that killed dozens and dozens of mostly women, I think, that worked there. Did that accident affect the quality of the powder?
I believe that some of the powder that's being replaced in the summer of '63 is because of that. So, yeah, you're finding a different distributor now for this one month. Yes.
So the Battle of Brandy Station is famous for being the transition of the Union cavalry, and a lot of that, our understanding of that's validated by reports from Confederates saying, "Hey, these guys can play ball now." Was there any sort of similar thing occurring among any primary sources from the Union side after Cedar Mountain saying, "Hey, the Confederate artillery, they can play ball now"? Is there any corresponding relationship with that?
It wasn't a matter of seeing Federals report that, wow, the Confederates have come of age, but more along the lines of being self-focused. Wow, we really got into a hard place. We had a very difficult fight. We were caught in converging fire. They were describing the experience without giving the credit to the people that put them in that spot. But as they go along, we're going to start seeing moments where the Federals are going to start seeing patterns. Cedar Mountain's the first time out, so we don't have a pattern yet. We have an incident. When we get to Second Manassas, just a couple weeks later, we have a coincidence, because now we've had a second incident. But after we start looking at what are the Confederates doing at Antietam, we are now looking at massed guns in an offensive capability, in a defensive capability, but we're starting to see patterns. It takes a while to discern a pattern. By the time we get to places like Fredericksburg, the Federals are starting to look at how do you negate that? And they're going to look for overwhelming firepower. Not necessarily have battalions, but the idea of I'm just going to grab a bunch of batteries and reserve artillery and line them all up. I'm going to take them away from Union divisions for a moment, and then I'm going to give them right back. They're going to mass 183 guns against Lee. That's recognition that Lee's artillery has made them change their doctrine. When we look at places like Chancellorsville, the Federals are fighting in woods, albeit, so not great for artillery, but they're able to marshal and field a group of 40 guns outside the Chancellorsville clearing around Fairview. The problem is that the Confederates are able to also put 40 guns at the other end of an open piece of ground called Hazel Grove, and another 15 guns up on the turnpike, which creates 3 sides of a triangle, with the Confederates owning 2 of the triangle corners. They can bring all their stuff to a point, while the Federals have to diffuse theirs in 2 different directions just for survival. Again, the Confederates they don't have better ground necessarily, but they have better angles. The Federals are going to recognize these things. At Gettysburg, it's interesting what the Federal guns do on July 3rd. Do they respond to the Confederate barrage? Initially? Whose order? William Winfield Scott Hancock. An infantry commander who decided that artillery should fight artillery. And yet somebody shut those guns down real quick. Who did that?
Henry Hunt.
Henry Jackson Hunt, the artillery chief. Because he's not going to waste his time going up against the Confederate guns. It is a prelude to an attack. That's what you need your guns for. So, this is a federal artillery commander who's deliberately not going to fight Confederate artillery at this point. That's a choice. Yes?
The Confederate battalion system was very good, but it had a lot of flexibility within the Corps. But a lot of the Second Corps artillery was very ineffective on day 3 at Gettysburg. Pendleton did not shift that battalion to the south. Whereas my great-grandfather's battery fought in Peach Orchard on the 2nd and Cemetery Ridge on 3rd, because he was in the Armored Potomac's artillery reserve. They were much more flexible than the the artillery that they had.
It was weird. I won't deny that at all. Simply the idea that when the Confederates launched a massive assault on July 3rd, when you look at an attack, especially something of that size, you never look at the lead elements, those that are going to initiate the attack. You look for the people that are going to come second, the ones who are going to exploit the attack. The first ones in are going to be destroyed, but they're also going to keep everybody focused on them. And they very well might disrupt their enemy while doing it. But a fresh unit coming in right on their heels will be able to exploit all of that and change a near battle into a victory. At Gettysburg, who was supposed to follow Pickett?
Wilcox and Wyatt.
No, actually, they're supposed to be part of the attack itself. They're lead elements. The backup was an artillery battalion under Charles Richardson, which to me is really a very sad idea that they're going to be the exploit element. Artillery can do a lot of things, but I doubt that they can actually handle an attack single-handedly, even though Pegram tries it here. And we know what the results are, because Pegram tried it. So we don't hear much about Richardson because at the height of the artillery barrage, laughably inept Chief of Artillery, William Nelson Pendleton, grabbed the battalion and moved them. So that when everybody turned around and said, time for Richardson, nobody knew where he was. So he doesn't become part of the narrative, except for being left out of the story. It is remarkable that the Confederate artillery did so well at such a grassroots level. Because if we do talk about the Chief of Artillery, William Nelson Pendleton was an absolute failure. He was inept. He was in over his head. And he had a commission that put him ahead of all artillerists, and that didn't help. William Nelson Pendleton was in charge of the reserve artillery, and during the Battle of Malvern Hill, literally took all of the reserve artillery and put them into camp. He put them in reserve. So at the very moment that Lee needs artillery, his artillery is leaving the battlefield. It's bad communications on Lee's part, but it's also really bad on the part of the Chief of Artillery. You should have been able to size this up. He is going to be equally bad at 2nd Manassas, and that's why we didn't talk about him. We talked about Stephen D. Lee, a man who's a division artillery chief taking initiative. And then when we get up to Antietam, Pendleton is going to be absolutely disastrous in the retreat when it comes to Shepherdstown. At that point, we make him pretty much just an inspector. We're going to have him push the paper, or we're not going to let him give command of artillery units at all. July 3rd, he's still gonna do it. It's interesting that E. Porter Alexander says the finest day the Confederate artillery ever had was at Chancellorsville, at precisely the one spot that Granny Pendleton was not. The one battlefield he wasn't on.
You know, one of the things that you talk around, we haven't considered it, but it's worth considering, I think, is Bolivar Heights. That was another Confederate success before Charlottesville.
Which one?
Bolivar Heights.
Boulevard Heights?
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, the siege at Harper's Ferry was very effective. And the Confederates were very industrious and very creative at how they were able to get guns into seemingly impassable pieces of ground.
Taking up the heights on-
Right. Putting them up on Loudon Heights, putting them up on Bolivar Heights, Schoolhouse Ridge, and being able to turn Bolivar Heights. It's just remarkable and impressive.
The other question I have for you is, the Confederate left at Malvern Hill. How many guns did the Confederates, how many batteries did the Confederates have at one time? Was it 4? And they were coming and going and.
The Confederates were coming and going big time. There were elements of, I think, 16 batteries that made a presence there, but no more than
4 at a time, was around.
no more than 6 guns.
Right?
No more than 6 guns at any point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was it? People had just gotten his Napoleons. He had lost all his guns and they gave him Napoleons.
Oh yeah. Well, they're over on the Confederate right, and.
That's what I meant. I don't know
Okay.
if I said that.
Oh yeah. For some reason I was thinking left when I was thinking Poindexter Farm. They're even smaller out there on the
Yeah.
Carter's Mill Road. They never get more than 4 guns.
It's four batteries, right?
There's going to be elements of 6 different batteries
Oh, yeah.
that are going to be out there, but they literally go out one at a time, piecemeal, and by the time a second battery shows up, the first one's already been chewed to bits and is out of there. I had one image on here of a busted up battery at Malvern Hill, which is right there where Pingram's battery was. It was a shambles. It
And
was.
again, they had 6-pounders mixed in with whatever they had.
Oh yeah, they were using their little 6-pounders up against Federals with big high charge rifles. The members of the Richmond Howitzers referred to their guns rather derisively as pop guns. We took our pop guns against their cannon and never stood a chance.
Hey, Frank, I'm looking forward to laying my eyes on the actual words. I guess it'll be next spring, is that?
I'm hopeful. I have the manuscript with the Savas Beatty Publishing Company right now, and we're looking to get it out next spring or early summer.
Excellent.
So fingers crossed. We'll see what happens. I want to thank you for spending a little bit of time with me today, and consider a part of your battlefield that a lot of people don't really think about. One of the most lasting legacies that comes out of what happens all around this very church is going to sustain the Confederate Army in Virginia for the next several years. Thanks for spending some time with me.